Good morning, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to Orlando and Martha and Janelle and everyone I talked to leading up to this event for inviting me and having me out here to work with you all and collaborate. And a huge sense of gratitude to all of you in this room. What I say to my students all the time is that you made dozens of choices in the morning. And one of the most important choices you've made already is the choice to show up and to be here. And I'm so appreciative that you fought the traffic, that you've taken some time out of your very busy schedules to show up today and to collaborate and to try to learn from one another. So thank you for making that choice. Now, I'll talk a little bit about my role, a little bit of my background, and my purpose for being here today. But I do want to start off generally by reviewing some of the things that were brought up with my introduction. So the first thing I want to acknowledge is that there are a few elephants in the room. There's some context that needs to be set. And the first elephant in the room is the fact that I look really, really young. And I know that, and I feel that every time I come into a speech or presentation, and you can totally own it, raise your hand if you had that thought at some point of he looks really young. He looks like he is teaching, not necessarily teaching high school, being in high school. He looks like he's 14. And I get that all the time. Every year with our staff photos, I get asked what grade I'm going into. And I've been asked multiple times by our Marine recruiter what I'm planning to do after high school. So I'm totally familiar with that. So just know that some of my background, I am a real teacher. I've been teaching for 10 years, and I'm very passionate about teaching. Now, another thing as far as context to set overall is that there was some initial discomfort with the decision to speak here today. And some people might have thought maybe the discomfort is because I'm a public school teacher and I don't work in a charter school. But I will tell you with conviction that I do not see education in terms of public versus charter. What I see in terms of education are schools that embrace change and those that don't. And I don't care in what form that looks like to embrace positive change, whether it's a public school, a charter school, a private school. As long as we are embracing change to a positive end for students, I am all in. But that's not the discomfort. The slight discomfort came from the fact that this is organized by Central Michigan University, and I'm a Western Michigan Bronco. And so, yeah, go Broncos, like the one other person in here. But I'll tell you, I got over that very quickly, just like I got over the fact that Western is no longer going to have a good football program now that PJ Fleck left. So that discomfort is beyond why I'm here today. So the last thing that I'll talk about in terms of context is I cannot and I am not here to tell you how to change. I don't know your students. I don't know your role. I haven't been in your situation before. Later today, you're going to have a lot of opportunities to learn from schools about how to change and what are the little examples and the big examples to make that change. But I can't provide that for you. Instead, what I'm here to talk about is the idea of change. I've spent the last 10 years studying psychology and teaching psychology to understand what goes from not wanting to change to actually making change. And so my hope today is that we better understand that process. Why do people resist change? And what are the factors that affect someone to make change? And I invite you to think not just about yourself, of those moments when you are resistant to change, because we all are at certain points. And not just about yourself in terms of the changes you're making, but also the students you work with. What are the moments and the factors that have a student resisting positive change in their world and advancing to actually making change? By the end of the day, we'll understand that process. I'll provide plenty of examples, and more importantly, looking at what is the in-between. So what are the mindsets that we need to go from resistance to actually making change? That is my hope for you all today. Now, my slides aren't clicking through quite to the effect that I'm hoping, so I might have to just do some freestyling. I hope you are prepared for that. And we're going to start with just looking at the basic continuum of change. So on one end, we have resistance to change. Just go ahead and nod your head for a moment if you've ever resisted change before, because all of us have. We know that that's human. On the very other end is actually making positive change. And again, nod your head if you have made change before in your world. Now, it's not just a factor of I'm not making change and now I'm making change. There are some steps in between. One of the first steps from resisting change to making change is what we know as motivation for change. And we talk about this idea of if you are motivated to change, then change will happen. But that's not entirely true. Because all of us are also motivated to change. The motivation is the want and the desire. But just because I want to change doesn't mean that that change is going to happen. Instead, there's a third step along this continuum. And that is what we call volition to change. That is the willpower. That is the actual decision. That is the actual action step to begin the process. And we have to look at that phase. I'll give an example. I looked in the mirror the other day and had that moment of, oh my gosh, I'm expanding a little bit. I'm starting to, get the little flub, the extra fat tire right here. And so I became instantly motivated to change. I was like, all right, I'm going to change. Now, just saying I'm going to change doesn't mean any change is going to happen. Instead, I need to shift to the volition. That means I actually need to make the decision to stop drinking so much delicious Michigan beer, to make sure I actually get onto a treadmill no matter how much I hate running. It's that moment of moving from I am motivated to change to now I'm actually taking the action steps. And we're going to be exploring that all along the way. Today, I'm going to share some ideas, some mindsets of how do we get from resistance to motivation. And then how do we get from motivation to volition? And then how do we get from volition to the actual change that needs to happen? And to go there, I'm going to share a lot about my greatest teachers that have taught me so much about change. Now, the first teacher that I'd like to point out is my son. Now, I have a 1.5-year-old at home. Raise your hand if you have a child in the world. All right. Keep your hand up if you have more than one child in the world. Okay, there are a lot of people I need to talk to. I don't know how you have more than one, because this guy's exhausting. Like, I go home and I'm like, how do people manage more than one of these beasts? This is my son, Maddox. And actually, to make sure that no one's left out, raise your hand if instead of children, you have chosen to have free time and disposable income. Good for you. Envy, just pure envy right now. So I love my son, but my son has taught me more about change than virtually anyone. And he's taught me about resistance to change compared to actually making change in his world. I've seen him being resistant to change, as simple as changing his diaper, and he resists. I've seen him make some huge changes. But he's also taught me a lot about my own psychology, of how I might be motivated for him to change and to make change, but sometimes I'm also resistant. I love that he's changing and learning new words. I'm totally motivated for that. But I'm resistant to the independence that comes along with that, and the change when he learns the word no and says no to everything. Do you want a green bean? No. Do you want to take a nap? No. Can I get a hug? No. Like, those are hard, and I have that resistance initially happening. But he has taught me a couple big ideas. All of us have a natural desire to change and risk. And we're going to talk about that. And yet all of us also have a fear of change and risk. All of us have conflict that happens that prevents that change from happening. He is one of my greatest teachers. The other teachers you're going to hear me talk about that have taught me about change are other students I've worked with. And I've worked with some amazing students and some really, really challenging students. So the background, a little bit more about my positive psychology program. I decided to spearhead with our school a big change to how we taught students who had exceptional needs. And we tried to flip the model of not just talking about the academic piece. So instead, we started to look at the social emotional piece. And we started a program where I would work with students. We would select them for a variety of needs for 12 weeks and just teach them about social emotional needs, emotional regulation, the science of well-being, how to manage that motivation. And initially, we had some really, really good results. We were able to reduce our failure rates by over 50% between their freshman year to sophomore year. We saw their overall grade point average raise dramatically. We had students who were raising their grit scores, their optimism scores. We had these really positive results. I was able to watch the resistance when they walked in of, why am I in this class, to the actual change happen. But I've also worked with students who got stuck here and being very resistant to change. A few years ago, I had a group of students who, halfway through the year, they hadn't made any move from I am not changing to maybe even thinking about changing. And I became very frustrated because I was doing everything I could. I was trying to sell the program to them, help them understand, but they weren't moving. Now, these were students who had many, many factors going against them, many levels of trauma, starting drugs in middle school, having a close friend of theirs commit suicide in 8th grade, having parents come in and out of their lives. They had all of the factors that would make someone potentially not want to change in certain ways. But I had a realization that one of the biggest reasons they didn't want to change is because they stopped believing in the point of school as a whole. They didn't see the main event, the purpose of school. And I worked with them very closely to understand why. And one of the biggest things I found out is that they believed that the main event of school was simply to graduate. All they heard was discussion about passing classes. All they heard was discussion about what their SAT score was going to be. All the discussion was about, are they going to make it to graduation day? And unfortunately, these students didn't see the value of that. They didn't see the why behind that. They didn't believe that graduating was going to make their life any different. And so I had this very, very rough moment where I had to confront that reality. That until we see the purpose of change, until we see the main events of change, there will not be a motivation to change. So the question is that we need to ask ourselves first, what is the main event of change that you plan to make? What is the purpose of school? And how does your view of the purpose of that change affect all the ripple effects that go on in a student's world? Now, I had a moment where at 4 o'clock in the morning, these thoughts were spiraling. And so I was sitting there ruminating like teachers do. And I just went out and typed out my thoughts. I eventually published it as a blog called What Students Really Need to Hear. There is a video if you are interested in watching it. I'm not going to use our time today to watch that. But it was that moment of trying to help my students shift that reality. And I'll talk about the effect of having that conversation with students. But we're going to continue looking at this process of the main event. Now, the terminology main event is something I gained and learned from an individual, Buckminster Fuller, who was an architect, a thinker, a theorist in America. And Buckminster Fuller looked at this idea of not just the purpose of a system, of a change, but also the ripple effects. We'll take a prime example. We've already heard talk about bees one time today. So think about a bee. And we're going to look at the interaction, the motivation, the moment of a bee visiting a flower. And consider what is the main event of a bee visiting a flower. Now, what's interesting is when you think about that, sometimes we think or initially have the thought that the main event is pollination. But that's not the main event for the bee. The bee doesn't care about pollination. The bee is just visiting the flower for some honey, to be able to get the nutrients, to make the resources so that it and the other creatures can survive. But Buckminster Fuller would refer to the processional effect of that main event, the ripple of the rock getting dropped into the water. And he would talk about every choice we make has a processional effect. Our view of the purpose of school and the purpose of our change affects how we interact with it. My students, because they only saw school as a point of graduation, the ripple effect was that they gave up. They didn't see the purpose of why. They didn't understand that algebra wasn't just to pass a class. They didn't see that algebra was about problem solving and learning how to tackle the situation and find the solution. They didn't realize that one of the main events of writing an essay isn't to make sure that you can impress a teacher. It is understanding how to construct a thought in a way that will inspire and affect others. So we're going to look at this idea of what is our main event for change and how does it affect others. And I would like you to consider this question. For you, in your role as an administrator, a board member, someone who helps authorize schools, what is the biggest change you are hoping to make? What's the purpose of that change? And what are the processional effects? Now, we're going to go for this moment where it's going to turn from a monologue to a dialogue. Because I'm a believer that dialogue is superior to monologue. So it's going to be a moment where you're actually going to turn to the people at your table and talk through this question. Now, if you're the type of person that is like, ew, people, like now's a really good time to find that fake phone call and get up and walk away. But otherwise, the invitation is for you to chat with the people nearby you. What is the change, the purpose of the change you seek to make? And what are the effects, both positive and negative, of that change? Now, just so you know, I'm a teacher. I'm going to have a little signal to attention. So you're going to talk, collaborate. When you hear this bell, that's going to be the signal to return back to our conversation. What is the change you want to make? Why do you want to make it? And what are the effects? Enjoy the talk. Please take a moment to thank the people that you shared some thoughts with or heard from. Step one in embracing change is knowing what we want to change and why. Unless there is a why, there's no motivation to change. And as you continue throughout the day, consider your main event for change and how the schools you interact with, the people you interact with, might help that motivation. And once we understand the why, now we start looking at the other mindsets that come into play. And one of the next mindsets that we need is the mindset for risking. We cannot embrace change until we embrace risk. Now, that word risk has many connotations, but we're going to unpack that a little bit. And I would love for you to consider a human child. And imagine a human child just being born into the world. And I want you to think about what would that child's resume look like first thing into the world? What is its skill set? And I'll tell you from experience, this was my son's resume when he came out. Like, he was not college and career ready, not any employable skills. Like, this was his world. Particularly the one at the bottom that says cry, that was his greatest skill. He was really good at that. He was a colicky mess for like 3 months. And his whole world was just this. However, every human being is born with not just these skills. Every human being and every brain is wired to take risks. We do not grow unless we take risks. We do not change until we try something new. It's the basics of the world. And it is because we are wired at birth to risk that we gain new skills, that we make positive change. It's why we learn to walk. But I want you to consider, how do we treat risk for children, for students, for ourselves? Because the evolution of how we treat risk is really fascinating to me. I want you to imagine how we treat risk with that early child development. So imagine a kid taking the first steps. Raise your hand if you've seen that happen before. Yeah, it's a really magical moment. So like, this is what it looks like. Like, kid is like braced and wobbly, and like the parents are like surrounding. They're like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, it's gonna happen. Wobble, and then all of a sudden it's like, here we go, first step. Wham! Kid falls on the ground. Now, no child that I've ever known of goes from this to, hello, mother, hello, father. Like, they fail. They like have a terrible moment. They take a risk and it doesn't pay off. But what do parents do? Parents celebrate that. Yeah, good job, get on your camera, get on your camera. They put the kid back up. Risk again, risk again, risk again, try it again. And kid, wobbly, steps, bam, again. And we celebrate that risk because we know that's how growth happens. Now, take that and apply it to how we sometimes treat student risk. My wife teaches second grade. She taught first grade for a while. And so it's hilarious, like, going into her classroom, because kids will risk an idea all the time. We'll step up and be like, all right, we're going to read a story. I have a story. I want to talk about the story. Like, all the hands shoot into the air. I've worked in middle schools, though. You ask a question, and a middle school response looks like this. I teach high school. I ask a question, and the response is this. It's fascinating because the culture is what goes from this to this. Because a student first offers out an idea, takes a risk. What's 2 times 6? 13. Now, do we celebrate that risk, or do we just celebrate the result? Because sometimes we say, good answer, and we applaud that. Sometimes we say, wrong answer. Who has the right answer? yeah, now we have the right answer. And in that moment, a student learns that unless the risk is guaranteed to pay off, I'm not going to take the risk. And that translates to adulthood. Unless I believe there is a certainty that this risk is going to pay off, I'm not going to take the risk. And as a process of that, we develop this fear. We are afraid to risk because we're afraid to fail. We are afraid to risk because we're afraid that socially we're going to be frowned upon. The risks we're talking about making, we're not talking about physical risks. So our brain is wired to avoid physical risks that could lead to pain. Even though as a child we learn to walk, eventually we try to avoid that pain. We're talking about social emotional risks. And even then, our brain is wired to try to prevent that unless we know there's a payoff. So we need to consider, how do we treat risk? Do we celebrate the risk even if it doesn't lead with guarantee to results? And later we're going to talk about how do we learn from that. I also do want to unpack the idea that risk doesn't automatically mean innovation. I read an interesting op-ed piece a little while ago about how we're obsessed with the word innovation to the degree where we think everything has to be recreated from scratch, that I have to scrap the entirety of a model and try something completely brand new. That's how change is going to happen. Sometimes a risk is taking what we know works and applying it in a slightly different way. And you will get that experience today. There are schools that aren't completely reinventing the wheel. They're just doing something with fidelity and integrity to a point that it's effective. So don't feel like you need to go back to your schools and be like, all right, we're done. Like, fire everybody. Let's start fresh. That's a risk. We're not talking about that. We're talking about trying something even though we don't guarantee it's going to pay off. So we're going to consider our next question, what I call an audacious action step. And consider, if you knew it would succeed, what risk would you take to benefit students? What would be the thing you would do? You would wave your magical wand and that risk would pay off. Consider your thoughts, because we're moving into another dialogue. So if there was one thing you could risk or try out and you knew it would guarantee to pay off, what would you do? Once you have a thought, check in with the people at your table. How would you answer this question? Once again, please say thank you to the people you shared some thoughts with. So, we have to know the why, the main event of our change, and therefore we have to embrace risk before we embrace change. Now, with risk comes the next mindset we have to prepare for, and that is this wonderful world called failure. And I would love to introduce what I call a failure fuel mindset and how we frame failure within our worlds. My son taught me a lot about risk taking. My students have taught me a lot about the psychology of failure. And one of the best ways that I see this is with a team building event that some people have played or seen in a variation. It's something that we refer to as the maze. The maze is an event I give all of my students, and here's the gist of it. So you see a grid. I have created a specific pathway from point A to point B, and students don't know the pathway. What they have to do is, one at a time, take a risk and step into a square. And if it's the right square, I don't say anything. If it's the wrong square, I say beep. And then they have to retrace their steps out. And then the next student has to go. Now, this is set up in a context where it is completely silent. They can't talk to each other at all. There's no verbal communication. It's a timed event, and every time they break a rule by talking or trying to write down the path, they hear a buzz, and a minute gets added to their score. Some classes, it takes them 30 minutes to figure out the path and get everyone through. Some classes, it's taken us 2 days to get through it. Now, the whole point isn't from getting from point A to point B. The whole point is failure. Because every little beep, every little buzz is a little failure. It's something that doesn't go our way. But what's fascinating is the response to the failure. Because some students, they get the failure, they get the buzz, they get the beep, it's silent, they're getting this moment of like, I don't know what's happening, and they increase their motivation. And all of a sudden, they're like, dialed in, trying to figure it out. They're helping each other out by like suggesting silently. Other students, the very first time they fail, they check out. and they get frustrated. I've had some kids just like go sulk in the corner and get on their phones. I've had some students like reach a moment where they start yelling. Now, the beautiful thing about this event is it's in a controlled environment. So we debrief and talk through all those reactions. And I let them know that whatever the reaction was, it was safe in here, so let's talk about it. But what we're ultimately looking at is this idea that we experience failure all the time. Yet we label failure with a negative connotation. We say things like fail. Students will say epic fail to each other as an insult. Now, failure isn't anything we want to have happen, but it happens. But what dictates our results, what dictates the change that happens is when failure does occur, what is our next path? Do we go to this level of fear and frustration? Because I failed, now I quit. Because I failed, there's no point. Because I failed, I must be deficient. And when we reach that moment, change stops. Because I'm not going to motivate to change if I don't have some reason why. The other path is we use failure as feedback. Every time we make a mistake is an opportunity to learn. And because we use that as feedback and flip that mindset, we see failure as fuel. How do I learn from every single mistake? Every single lesson I teach, I reflect, what could I have done better? What did I do wrong? How did they not get this concept? What could I have adjusted? Why aren't students raising their hands? What is the fuel behind that? How do I motivate myself? How we treat failure is going to affect that moment. Because if I've taken the risk, I have the motivation, I've tried the change, but I'm unwilling to face failure, then I'm going to resort right back to resistance. So there's a couple things we can consider. The first is, how has failure influenced your main event? You want to go back? Yep. Hey, ask and you shall receive. So how has failure influenced your main event? I'll talk about my program, my positive psychology program. There were some big successes, I've talked about that, but there are also a lot of failures. And one failure I learned from is the idea of putting all of our students who are at risk in the same group together. Initially it worked because it was a small group. But as you may know, in education, sometimes districts change. And our district started to change with a lot more trauma, a lot more poverty. So the need started to grow. Now all of a sudden, 30 students who are all dealing with emotional regulation and academic issues packed into one room, very hard to work with. And we learned that not only was it hard to have them all in one class, but because of their scheduling, they were in all the same classes together. All of them were in the same math class, the same English class, the same science class, and we had created 2 schools. We had tracks without ever even meaning to. We learned from that failure, and we've revamped our system. We've opened up the program as an elective that any student can take, and many students want to take it. So now we have targeted students mixed in with peers who are more motivated, with peers who see the value in school, with peers who will hold them accountable, and we've seen that shift happen. That would not have happened if we didn't confront the failure and own it. And there's also another interesting relationship between failure and feedback. Sometimes we don't ask for feedback because we're afraid it's going to reveal failure. Sometimes we don't ask what we're doing wrong because then I'm afraid that I'm going to admit that I am deficient. So what would it look like if you asked for feedback and knew that you might learn some failures and then use that for fuel? Halfway through every trimester, I ask my students an interesting question. How have I failed you? How has the school failed you up to this point? And it takes a tough skin to ask that question to teenagers, because teenagers are no joke. Teenagers will tell you straight up how you have failed them, especially if you allow it to be anonymous. And I have had some really tough responses from students. Some of them are even beyond my control. Some of them are directly within my control of the language I use, the way I communicate with them, the way I structure things. But because I embrace failure, I am willing to ask the hard feedback. I'm willing to ask the tough questions. Imagine what would happen if you asked your stakeholders this question. In what ways have I failed you? Imagine if as students come into your school, they were asked that question, in what ways has your past school failed you? In what ways has education as a whole failed you? Imagine the feedback we would get if we could own that level of failure. So we're not going to dialogue about this one yet, but just ponder. How are you asking for feedback? How are you confronting failure and using it as fuel? Now, our next mindset, when we face failure, how do we take it to the next level? My greatest teacher for this one is a girl named Claudia. I first had Claudia in 9th grade. And you would know Claudia when she came into your room. And here's why. When she was in elementary school, she was a typical elementary student, involved in sports, doing well in school, had a lot of friends. One night, randomly, unexpectedly, tragically, she woke up completely paralyzed. A blood vessel popped in her brain or had some aneurysm, and she lost the ability to move. She couldn't walk, she couldn't talk, she couldn't swallow, she couldn't blink, she couldn't do anything. Fast forward, she's in my class in 9th grade. She would have to use a walker stabilized by people behind her just to step into the room. She had a cup that she would spit into because she didn't have the ability to swallow her own saliva anymore. But what was fascinating to me is that she was one of the most resilient human beings I've ever met in my life. Because no matter how tragic and seemingly permanent that adversity was, she never gave up. She came to every single class. She completed every single assignment. When I would pose a question, her hands would take 5 seconds just to even make it into the air, and another 10 seconds just to start to articulate her answer. And she did all of it with the best smile she could muster on her face. Now, she is still, even in college and beyond, fighting, but she is developing every single day. There are videos of her rock climbing. There are videos of her taking her first major steps without assistance. This girl dealt with adversity, and she persevered no matter what. When we talk about resilience, we're going to talk a little backstory behind resilience. And let's talk about a concept called learned helplessness. Raise your hand if you've heard of or seen learned helplessness before. Yeah, all of us have, because we've either experienced it or we watch students experience it. So backstory, I'm going to geek out a little bit and talk about the science behind it. One of the most well-known studies in psychology, one of the most groundbreaking views of how people interact, comes from a main researcher, Martin Seligman, who started some research on dogs. Now, it's a really unethical study now, like we wouldn't allow this to happen the way it did. But here's the backstory. Round one, and you may be familiar with this story. Round one, groups of dogs were randomly broken into 3 groups, Group A, Group B, Group C. Group A, for round one, nothing happened. They just chilled in a little puppy crate. Group B was harnessed and would have little electrical shocks start randomly. And the dog had a few different little instruments, little levers, little things it could hit. And if it could find the right lever to hit, whoop, the shocks would stop. This dog had control to try to end the adversity. Now, linked to dog B was dog C. And dog C didn't even know dog B existed. But at the same time a shock would start for B, it would start for dog C. And then all of a sudden, the dog would have levers, and it would hit the levers. But it would only stop when the dog B figured it out. So imagine you're that dog, and all of a sudden you get shocked, you start hitting things, and then all of a sudden it stops, and you don't know why. And then it starts up again, and you hit that same lever, but it doesn't stop. That was round one. That was just preparation for round two. For round two, they took all the dogs independently and put them in a little shuttle. And so on one end, the floor was electrified. There was a little hurdle that if the dog jumped over, it would make it into the next safe space. And they wanted to see how the dogs would interact. So the question is, Group A, did they jump over the hurdle to safety, yes or no? Shout out and answer. This is collaborative here. Yeah. Did they jump? Yeah, they jumped. Of course, like if you were getting punched in the face, you would avoid it. If you're not used to getting punched in the face, you'd be like, nope, not doing that anymore. So all of them jumped. We would expect that. Group B, did they jump, yes or no? Yeah. Yes, they did, because their experience told them, I have control over this adversity. This adversity will not last forever. And so they jumped. And then Group C. Did Group C jump? Most of them didn't. About 2/3 of the dogs just laid down, taking the shock. They gave up. They learned to be helpless because their experience told them that I have no control. But what's interesting is that a lot of people focused on that. They wanted to focus on like the giving up portion. Martin Seligman wanted to focus on the other interesting fact that a third of the dogs still jumped, even though their experience told them, I can't do anything. They recreated this study using like annoying sounds for humans. And they found similarly that even humans in group C that had no control previously, they will still try. Why? And this is what leads us to something known as optimism-pessimism. So the basic model, all of us experience adversity, some more than others, and we know that adversity can have a huge impact on us. We know that chronic adversity and stress can impact us, and we know that poverty can impact us, but it's not the only factor. One of the other major factors is how do we treat that adversity? You may be used to what's known as dispositional optimism, like the half glass full, I'm happy all the time. That's a different optimism than what we're talking about. What Martin Seligman realized is that what dictated that third versus the 2/3 is that a third of them adopted a belief that no matter what the adversity was, it was temporary. And they would keep it specific to that adversity. So they would recognize that this shock isn't going to happen forever. This sound isn't going to happen forever. This moment of frustration with my spouse isn't going to happen forever. This student being disrespectful to me is not going to happen forever. And they also don't universalize it across the spectrum. Pessimists do the opposite. They talk about it in very permanent terms. And they talk about it in very universal terms. I can talk, prime example in education. When we say things like education is failing, we are using a very universal pessimistic view. Because some places, education is failing. Some schools, it is, but many schools, it isn't. Even within a school, some teachers are having a hard time embracing change, and so they're not making solid ground. But even within those schools, some teachers are. So we have to be conscious of how we treat it in a permanent versus a temporary manner, and how we view it in terms of a universal versus a specific manner. I've worked very hard not to label my students. And I make sure every single day they get a fresh start. Even when a kid gets frustrated and cusses me out, the next day they walk into my room, hey, welcome. I'm glad you made the choice to be here. Because that was a temporary moment. That was a specific moment in time. And that adversity doesn't dictate what happens next. If we want to embrace change, we have to know that when failure happens, it's not going to last forever, that we can rebound. And as a result, we can try to continue to embrace change. So when I talk about resilience, this is what I talk about. Resilience is recognizing that the current and future failure is not permanent, and it's not universal. It's also recognizing that my past failures are not permanent, are not universal. That every single day I get to make choices that allow me to be resilient. Consider this as you're going through and you're considering what risk you're going to take. Sometimes we don't want to take a risk because we think it's going to be this permanent failure forever. It might hurt. We might make a risk. We might try a change and it doesn't work and it's unpleasant, but that unpleasantness won't last forever. So we have to be resilient. Now, one of the last mindsets I'm going to talk about is the big picture mindset. And it's something that was alluded to when we saw our singers, our wonderful singers this morning, of keeping students always at the forefront of our minds. And we're going to start with a very basic question. Why are you here today? And I'm not talking like the metaphysical like consideration of life, like what's the purpose of my life. I'm talking about just the very basic, what are you here to gain? Are you here just to make an appearance and bump some elbows? Are you here to learn specific things? Are you here to present what you've experienced in your world? Why are you here? What is your purpose today? And we're shifting into dialogue. So how do you answer that question? Why are you here today? And once you have your answer, check in with those beautiful people to your right and your left. Enjoy the chat. At this time, please go ahead and smile at your colleagues, even if you're faking it right now. Just give them some smile. So, this brings us back to that main event. And we need to know why. And we need to know why we are doing what we're doing. And there is a person who has taught me that more than any other. And it's another young adult that I was fortunate to interact with. His name's Dustin Collier. Now, interestingly, I never had Dustin as a student, but I have developed a connection with him throughout. I have had a lot of his friends, and I'll tell you some of that backstory. But in order to understand how Dustin has taught me about purpose and taught me about the big picture, he's another one of those individuals who is more resilient than anyone I know. When he was in, I believe, 5th grade, he was diagnosed with a very rare form of cancer called Wilms tumor. And he was told that he was probably not going to make it another year. Imagine being in 5th grade and hearing that. But Dustin fought, and he fought, and his family fought, and he became cancer-free. Until a few years later, he was re-diagnosed. The cancer was back. And again, he had to question this idea of purpose. Why is it back? I'm trying to be a good person. I'm trying to fight. But he fought, and he fought, and he fought, and he cleared cancer. And then it came back a few years later, and he fought again. When he was a junior in our high school, his cancer had reemerged for the 3rd or the 4th time. Now, I remember at the time I was teaching a communications class, and I had them do a month-long group project. And the group project, the assignment is very simple. I tell them you have 1 month to make a positive impact. And they get to design whatever way that looks as a group. And I teach them about group problem solving and communication skills. One of Dustin's friends was in a group, and they decided the positive impact they wanted to change is they wanted to support their friends. They wanted to provide money so that the family could offset the huge costs associated with fighting cancer. So they designed t-shirts, and the t-shirts said, DC Strong, Dustin Collier Strong. And they started selling them. Within 3 weeks, they had raised $2,000 for their friends. That in and of itself was a big picture moment and really, really affected me. But they didn't stop when the project was done. After high school, they turned that process into a nonprofit organization. Today, if you were to type in DC Strong, you would see a link to their organization. And they have spent the last few years providing other children with the will to fight by making their day, by giving them courage. This year, they're slated to raise $100,000 to help students. That is a purpose. Today, Dustin is fighting again. He's had a few other adversities where the cancer started to increase. He's still on a daily basis having to fight. But because he and his friends have never lost sight of the bigger picture, they do everything they can to create positive change. That is the biggest last step that we can make, is not just knowing why, but how does it impact others? So I talk about what I refer to as spheres of influence. And sometimes when we're thinking about change, we're living in this sphere of how do I change to help myself? And it is perfectly okay to go here. There are times when I try a new strategy in the classroom because it'll save me some time. But typically, that's not really the motivating force. What really motivates people, and what really allows them to engage, what really allows them to embrace change, is never forgetting that the goal of my change is to help others change as well. Countless research has been done on something called generative goals, goals we set that are impacting other people. And people who set generative goals have more motivation, a higher sense of meaning, and have more resilience with those goals. In the workforce, researcher Amy Resniewski and Jane Dutton, Amy's at Yale, Jane Dutton, University of Michigan, have studied what allows people to engage in their work. And what they found is that one of the biggest factors of whether a worker will engage, will be resilient, will have meaning, is whether they see the bigger picture of what they do. So a custodian doesn't see it as just checking items off a list. A custodian sees it as, I'm creating a safe space for individuals so they can continue to thrive. What we get to do in the field of education is even to a higher level, because we get to help others so that they can help others in society. Focus on this sphere if you want the motivation to embrace change. We are not changing simply to survive as a school. We are not changing simply to get kids into college. We are changing because the impact I make on students has a ripple effect. So when you are going about your day, never lose sight of this question of how will your main event help others help others. Even if you have to get selfish for a moment and think about what you need to do, never lose sight of this bigger picture. And that is what fuels that change. Now, I have just a few more minutes, but there's one final thing, one final teacher, one final thing that I can help or hope will transform our belief about motivation and change. So we'll return to that in a moment. I want to talk about the urgent mindset. And I want to talk about a big spark. If you're trying to figure out whether you should embrace change or not, it's this. I learned about the urgent mindset from a student named Wes Leonard. Now, interestingly, I have never met Wes Leonard in my life. He doesn't even go to my school. He went to a school called Fenville, this like very tiny, middle of nowhere, typical like rural Michigan high school. Now, Fenville isn't really known for a whole lot. Like, there's not a lot going on in Fenville. But a few years ago, they had a major event because their basketball team was kicking butt. Their basketball team was on track to have a perfect season, something that had never been done before. And the all-star that everyone was putting their hopes into was this kid, Wes Leonard. He was a student who was a major athlete in football and basketball. He was setting records for points per game, points in a season. Like, he was their player. It's the final game of the regular season. If they beat their rival, Bridgman, they would have a perfect season. And it's the last few seconds of the game. And it's tied 55-55. Fenville has a chance to inbound the ball. They score, chances are they're going to win. And so they inball the ball, and they try to get it to Wes. And they get the ball to Wes. And he starts driving through, and there's a video where you can watch this all go down. It's almost like the waves part, and he just like dribbles through the paint, goes up for a layup, hits the backboard, and goes in. And the crowd goes freaking crazy. Like, this is a huge deal. Their defense is able to stop Bridgman, and all of a sudden they've won the game because of his last-minute shot. And the crowd goes wild. This is the actual moment afterwards where they lift them onto their shoulders, and the crowd starts chanting, Wes, 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 Wes. And then all of a sudden they realize that Wes isn't responding. And they lower him onto the court. And he's grabbing his chest. And people start screaming for help. Now, unfortunately, there's chaos because people have rushed onto the court. And unfortunately, there's no AED that people can find. It wasn't set up close to the gym. And people are in this mad scramble. And it turns to this. Within hours, Wes Leonard died. He was 17 years old. He had done everything right. He ate healthfully. He was a great human being. He wasn't someone who was like going against the doctor's orders. Like, he didn't even know he had a heart condition. And he had an enlarged heart. And that's what happens. And I heard this story, and it hit me. And it hit me because this idea of later, of tomorrow, is a very fragile thing. And it is not a real promise. Now, I know we're going to kind of like this emo place right now, but I think there's a reason why we should be reminded that tomorrow isn't a guarantee. That a 17-year-old can suffer tragedy like that. That as much as I might want to delay the change, as much as I might want to say, like, I'll get to that next week, we'll work on that next year, as much as I want to resist the fight to make that change, I have no promise that tomorrow even exists. And I have no promise that there will be another opportunity. So if you want an instant spark that will take you from resistance to change to making change, remember this, and remember Wes Leonard. Now, please don't go to this like really depressive place where then you're like, well, what's the point of life anymore? It's just like you check out. You're like, I'm not going to be at a conference if this is my last day. Like, don't go there. Just try to remember that life is fragile and time is precious. And that's why we call it the urgent mindset. Start today. Interact with people today. When you're tempted to go on Facebook or play some Candy Crush rather than interact with some people, make the decision that you only get one day with these people. You might even only have one conversation with that person. You might have one moment to share your story with people who need it. Take the opportunity, because later is fragile. Now, recapping all of this is like, if we were to put it in a flow chart right here, this is what we need to do throughout our time. Know what, why, and how we seek to change. What is the main event? We need to take those risks and embrace those risks. And because there are risks, we need to know that we might fail.
And when we face that failure, we use it as feedback and we learn from it. And we also realize that those failures are temporary and specific. They do not dictate our entire world. And as a part of all of this, remember why you are here and why you choose every single day to work with students and help their lives. And do not wait. Start now, because tomorrow is not a guarantee. I look forward to having a lot of really great conversations with you, and I'm very thankful. If you want to reach out to me, feel free to connect. I'm going to be milling about the room all throughout the day, and I'll talk to you at the very end. But I would love for you, more than anything, to acknowledge yourself for making the decision to be here and to impact student lives. And I would love for you to give yourself a round of applause for what you do. Thank you, everyone, for your time.